and I'm going to talk about the sugar mills of St. Croix, and we're going to have quite a few things. I'm going to talk about the lasting impact of the Caribbean sugar industry and why I think it's really important industry to study. We're going to talk about St. Croix and its place with the Virgin Islands in sugar production. I started this research looking at historic maps, and I think historic maps have a tremendous amount to tell us about how things changed over time. And I'm going to talk about what I found with the mills located in the field, and then I'll talk a little bit about the website that I'm wrapping up and getting ready to launch. And I invite you to ask any clarifying questions right away, but if you've got some more broader discussion questions, please hold them to the end, maybe jot them down. And if you'll see here, I think you can see my pointer, right? I've got a slide number here in the bottom right-hand corner. So you can say, go back to this slide or whatever you want to look at, talk about something more detail. I'm happy to do that. And one thing I kind of alluded to this previously, a lot of people look at things in the past and they just lump it all in one place. And a critical thing is it didn't happen all at once. So how did things change over time? And things grew, things changed, and you can learn from that. So why did I do this? So Willem noted I started interest in this in 1986 when I first went down to St. Croix. I lived there for about 5 years. I started this project in earnest in 1989 because I took a history class at the University of the Virgin Islands. And for my semester project, the instructor said, well, nobody knows how many sugar mills were ever built here, windmills. And so why don't you go find out? So 30 years later, here I am, and still kind of like, well, it depends if you think this windmill was actually built or not, or what did this icon mean on a map? And I really became intrigued by local history and really very interested in this. It was the home of Alexander Hamilton. His boyhood home shaped his life. And I really think Alexander Hamilton is one of the most impactful individuals that's ever lived when you look, certainly from the United States perspective. You're like, all right, how did this happen? And I got to visit every corner of the island. And you think St. Croix is an island that's 22, 23 miles long. There are people that live in Christiansted, which is kind of in the center of the island, north, east, west, that have never been to Frederiksted on the west end. People that lived in Frederiksted had never been to Christiansted. Okay, whatever. It's a small place, and people like stay in their not just lane, they stay in a little box. And I'm like, no, that's not me. Now, I did live there in the aftermath of Hurricane Hugo, which was a Category 5 storm and literally blew grass out of the ground. And that made it easy to find some of the windmills that I found. There was one that was on no maps. And I was driving by one day and said, look, there's a windmill. I wonder how I would get there. That's not on any of the maps. So we'll have a nice discussion about the historic maps and where they come from, and then what I found in the field. And that's all interesting stuff for me, and I hope that you'll find it interesting. Now, the sugar industry, I think, is one of the most impactful industries in human history. Okay, first of all, you have the commodification of sugar. Think that Queen Elizabeth, not the one that's currently in power, but the one back in Shakespeare's time, her teeth were all black because she ate sugar. But she was one of the few people in England that could afford to eat sugar on a regular basis. And the Caribbean sugar industry launched humanity to the commodification of sugar, and it's become an integral part of our diet. It's a great food preservative, but there's some downsides: tooth decay, diabetes, obesity. These are serious issues that we have to deal with. Thank you very much, Caribbean sugar industry, for bringing this to us. This is really the start of industrial farming on a large scale, monocropping, and really the first industry that unified both agricultural production and manufacturing in the same productive unit. So, the reason for that is once I harvest the sugar cane, I've got about 3 days to process that before it spoils, and then I've got about maybe 2 days after I squeeze the juice out to process that before it spoils. So I can't ship. I have to process the product before I can get it out. And here was a situation with the plantations where they explicitly were doing it all in-house at first. Globalization. I mean, this is a big foray into globalization. You know, I look back at what Alexander Hamilton done. I'm like, all right, I'm going to put this barrel of something in this boat, and I'm going to expect that it's going to get somewhere else, and then I'm going to get sent money back. Or somebody gives me the money and then they expect the product to be delivered. They had to figure the systems out. How did the money flow? And, you know, when you look at the money flowing, when you look at the cost of building a sugar plantation or purchasing a lock, stock and barrel ready to go sugar plantation, if you look at the amount of the equivalent value of silver that was invested at the time, what it is today, that's over $30 million. Okay, so the people doing this, they were not pikers. They were well connected. They knew what they were doing. They were, you know, they had to have some expertise because you're managing people, agriculture, manufacturing all at one time. It was a pretty sophisticated operation. Now there's a little dark underbelly here in the human migration. You've got, you know, the European entrepreneurs that came over, and we hear a lot about them. The owners, managers, the preachers came over too. But you also have indentured servants, and later they brought subcontinent Indians to the Caribbean to work in the plantations. And then there's this little black mark of the chattel slavery of Africans, which has had a lasting impact. And one reason you ended up with chattel slavery is that the European indentured servitude survivor rate on that was typically 5% or less. So if you look at a generation and say, well, you know, 95% of the people that went down there died, I'm just not going down there. And so that pipeline of labor dried up. Oh, well, let's just enslave people. That works. And there's been some uncomfortable legacies from that. And we don't want to overlook that. That's a serious issue. And then, of course, you have European colonization and piracy, all the fun stuff. Johnny Depp, you know, who thought that you could make a movie out of an amusement park ride? But hey, he did it, like several of them. And then, you know, just all the you know, one issue with there was a religious aspect of it. The Protestants, the Northern European countries telling Spain and Portugal, you know, you Catholic folks, we don't care. We're going to challenge you. And one reason you started in Barbados with the sugar industry, it was really far away from Puerto Rico, so the Spaniards couldn't come get them. Well, St. Croix is right next to Puerto Rico, so that came in pretty late. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So, you know, I've just gone over a number of things where the sugar industry has been extraordinarily impactful worldwide. And I've got this little graph. I hope you can see this. Soft drinks, just one current industry, would not exist without sugar. So 7-Up is right here. And I'm presuming you Europeans still know what some of these drinks are. Some I might have your own. Everything from 7-Up and above has more than 10% by weight of that drink is sugar. Yeah, so pretty impactful. So St. Croix, if you're not familiar where the Virgin Islands are, hopefully you know the Greater Antilles here with the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands are here. Here's St. Croix, here's San Juan. You can see, oh, the Spaniards want to come and they want to tell people not to get there. They can, it's pretty close. And St. Croix has been governed under 7 Western entities. In Spain, and St. Croix was the first, is the only place under the US flag where Columbus actually visited, and actually is reputed as the first place with a violent encounter between Native Americans and Europeans. After that, you have the English, the Dutch, the Knights of Malta. Yep, the Knights of Malta ran St. Croix for a while, then the French, and then the Danish, and we're going to talk mostly about the Danish period, and then the United States. The French had started a sugar industry in St. Croix. They abandoned it in 1696. They went over to what's now Haiti because they were quite correct in saying they have a brighter future in a much larger country in Haiti than they do in St. Croix. Of course, that only lasted till 1804. And there was a little bit of a social unrest there. So on St. Croix, the English, there were squatters that came in after the French left. Not a whole lot of sugar, mostly on the east end of the island, which is very dry. But they actually didn't get kicked out when the Danes came because they actually needed them to help the colony survive. When the Danish purchased the island from the French in 1733, and as I mentioned, this is really late for sugar production. Barbados was 1620, so Barbados was, or excuse me, 1640. So this was, you know, about a century late after Barbados got into the business. And that had some impacts on some of the technologies that got built. And it really took them about 15 years to get sugar production established because they had to survey the land, clear it. And this is a non-trivial task when you're looking at an area with a lot of bush and just, you know, I describe it as a thicket, and I'm reading some of the historic accounts. I've tried to get through some of the thickets, walking in and doing field work, and it can be in times impenetrable. And in historic times, they also talked about how some of the land was just the vegetation was impenetrable. You had to cut it down to be able to get through. Because St. Croix came in late in the industry, they were able to recruit some experienced settlers, people that knew what they were doing, growing sugar, had already some financial heft, and had the connections to make everything work from a practical standpoint. And the Danes offered religious and financial freedoms to a lot of people to say, hey, come on to St. Croix, come on here. And obviously you needed the money to make the capital investment, make it work. Now, the Danish purchased the island. They established the Danish West India and Guinea Company, and the company really didn't do a very effective job. So the crown said in 1754, you guys are out of here, we're taking over. And the Danes were there until they sold the islands to the United States in 1917. And the sugar industry was huge there from the 1750s, and then really petered out and finally was over in the 1970s. So it had a pretty good run, and certainly has left a lasting legacy on the landscape, and to the point where the windmills, or a lot of local people call them sugar mills, but I call them windmills because you have an animal mill, a windmill, a water mill. And when I talk about windmills, you're looking at this one in the center, or really this sort of thing. I'm focusing mostly on the windmills, but people do jewelry. You have this heritage trail. People do artwork. This is a watercolor, and this is actually a relatively new building that was built in the last 20 years at the University of the Virgin Islands. This is not, the windmill was never at this location, but it's been stylized into the architecture. It really is a cultural icon. So we'll talk a little bit about the mapping history now. Mentioned just in my opening comments about how the Danes did their applying straight lines on a spherical surface, you get into trouble after a while. But this was really unique, of someone coming into a landscape and saying, we're just going to make the whole thing into straight lines with right angles at the corners. And in fact, the experience in St. Croix was sufficiently interesting that when Thomas Jefferson made the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he wanted to know everything he possibly could about what happened in St. Croix, because he had a small parcel of land in North America that he had to get surveyed and settled and all that. The survey took about a decade, and one of the issues was that the Europeans that came out died, okay? Walter Reed hadn't figured out that mosquitoes, diseases like yellow fever, dengue fever, malaria, and the Europeans would die, all right? And it was hard to get labor. They had individuals called Campus Negroes, so they would borrow enslaved people from plantations to come out and draw this. And actually, these enslaved people are the ones that actually did most of the work to actually get the survey done. And I've talked to a lot of surveyors, and they say that it's pretty good survey for the fact that people are literally dragging these 50-foot long chains through the bush to say, all right, here's the line. You can imagine a small island. They had some equipment issues, and they had problems. This is a lot of cartography and surveying was fairly new at that point. They were stretching the limits of what's possible. So it's interesting that it worked out. Now, the Cronenberg and von Jagersberg's manuscript map, I'm going to show you in a moment, was the first map that actually got put in an archive somewhere in Copenhagen and was forgotten about until relatively recently. It's a beautiful map. And that map was published in, it was actually crafted in 1750, but they probably stopped data collection in October 1749. And anybody that knows any history of Alexander Hamilton will know that his mother was reputed to be a whore. Well, there's a reason, because his mother was shacking up with Cronenberg, the guy that was doing the survey. They both got arrested and thrown in jail for having an extramarital affair because she was on the outs with her husband, and they were having an affair, got caught in the act. They throw them both in prison, and then they both got kicked off of St. Croix. So you've got a hard date when Cronenberg stops collecting data in October 1749, because we can look at other sources and say, hey, guess what? He was gone. He wasn't collecting any more information. So just a colorful bit of history. And there's a musical called Hamilton that's very popular, that's really galvanized public opinion in the United States in favor of Alexander Hamilton. So this is the map that Cronenberg and von Jagersberg drew. It's generally very accurate. If you can see, the yellow parts are parts that he actually colored, and those are planted in sugar. There's some blue parts. You'll see more blue parts on the east end, but there's little blue parts that where cotton was planted. And then he drew, and we'll see some examples where he drew little squares on the map with an animal mill. Now, on the north side, this is a very hilly part of the island and very well watered. So there's lots of trees and other vegetation growing, extremely difficult to get through. In fact, I tried to walk up a hill around here in January that I could drive up 30 years ago. I couldn't even, I walked about 50 yards up the road, and I'm like, I can't get through this. It was too much. So in 1750, there was 3 windmills and 52 animal mills. And one of the things I'm trying to do with my research is quantify the growth over time, and then look at, all right, this mill was built at this time. All right, it's got certain features, and then there's different features that come out from time to time. All right, so the icons. We're going to look at a number of historic maps, and they have great information on them. All us windmill, various mill fans. You've got the windmill, and this is the legend from the map we just looked at, the Cronenberg von Jagersberg back. He's got the windmills, and they look, like a pretty good like a windmill. A horse mill or an animal mill with a circle with a dot in the middle, and then a plantation house, and then the slave quarters, Negro house. And then these are just the legends from some of the other maps. This is the Beck map. We'll talk about this some. There's a map by a guy named Kufna that he did a plantation with a sugar mill. So you're not sure, is that a windmill? Is it an animal mill? I don't know. And then Oxholm, and we'll look some more into his map. He did, it's a work of art, that map. And then this is the first United States topographic map around 1920. And they talk about stone fan mills with a fan in operation, no fan. And there's enough discrepancy between some of these. Sometimes it's hard to say, well, what exactly did that represent? So I try to go look for them in the field. And of course, we have some illustrations of what these look like in the field. And I know Willem at our last meeting talked about the various mills. You've got the three vertical rollers. Here's the animal mill, and the animals will go round and round. And then the juice has to go somewhere, so they build a little trough here, and then they have a little cover so that it's a horse, cattle, or donkey going over this, so they would be able to walk through it and not trip over it. And then you have the boiling house down here, and just the general pattern. And you're always going to have the mill higher than the boiling house, because you want the juice to flow downhill. So, interesting to know when the mills were built. Then there's also an interest, what happened to these towers, the stone towers and everything else, when the mills were decommissioned and no longer used. So the mills were taken out of service by the 1790s. And I say that because this is a little snippet here in the middle from the Oxholm map, which was published in 1799. He stopped collecting data in 1794 for this. And you see this little tower. And this little tower we're going to look at is called Fairplane. I'll show you what it looks like today. And they were taken out of service because you have some steam mills being built. and then you got centralization of sugar processing, because remember the beet sugar was coming in, and so you had to centralize. You had to accumulate more material in one place, bigger plantations, because you have to be able to compete with the cheaper sugar beets. And then they finally stopped cultivating sugarcane. In fact, there's an interesting case on the east end of the island where the people that were enslaved wanted to keep growing sugarcane because they were worried that they were going to all be separated and shipped out to different plantations if they stopped growing sugarcane. Now, in terms of new windmills, you got new windmills built through the 1810s, but you have stuff being taken out of service, and so there's a lot of dynamic stuff going on of what's working on this particular ground for this particular plantation owner. So just another couple examples here of things being decommissioned. Here, this is from the Parsons map, which is surveyed in 1851, published in 1856 originally. And he had a number of these towers, and this one he specifically called an old mill. And here you'll see this is the Fair Plain, the same location, and you have Annenberg here, which was a tower, decommissioned windmill. And then next to it, I think this might have been a steam chimney. I need to do a little bit more research, but I think that represented a steam chimney. I just need to look at his map and try to figure this out, because there's no legend on the map, so he didn't help you with that. And then another case, these two at the bottom, I think are fascinating, because there's a map done by a guy named Beck, and he published it in 1754 initially, but then there were some annotated copies through the 1760s into 1770s. And this is one of the later ones, and somebody takes a pen and marks out an animal mill that, okay, that's no longer operating there in two different estates. And actually, Beck did two different printings, and on the printing plate, you can see where he buffed out some animal mills between the two printings. And I'm still trying to figure out what they were trying to do. So we'll talk more about some of, as we go through some of the what happened to some of the mills, but the materials got removed for other building materials. They blocked them to store water. Like any small island, water is always a limiting factor. And then in some cases, they incorporated the windmill into a dwelling, and we'll see some examples of that. But that would have been a much more recent, post-agricultural development. So I promised you I'd show you the Fair Plain Foundation. This actually sits almost at the end of the runway of the big airport, and the runways. The runway's like, I don't know, 10,000, 15,000 feet. It's long enough you could land the space shuttle there if you needed to. And what they did here, remember, this is the one on the Oxholm map. So this was decommissioned very early. And you can see how the face of it used to be covered with this cut stone block. And they basically just tore most of it down, probably used that cut stone block for some other purpose. So talking about the Beck, I'm going to walk through some of these maps and just talk about them, and then we're going to look at some specific pictures of windmills and whatnot. So the Beck maps, initially printed in 1754, he stopped collecting data for the first printing in 1752. I estimate the second printing was actually printed based on data from about 1755, based on the number of mills on each one. In 1755, if you just draw a line and say, all right, how many mills can you build in a year? 1755 fits the date pretty well. And nobody's actually looked at these seriously. I'm the first person that I know of that has really seriously analyzed each of these maps. And there were people that were doing manuscript copies of these, and also just annotating the base map for a good 35-year period. This map is pretty iconic on the island. People talk about history. This image often comes up. And what's nice about this, even though I can't spell, apparently, it's the early growth of this Skugar industry. The 1750 map had 3 windmills. The first printing had 8 windmills, and then the next one had 21 windmills. And we'll look at each one of them in turn. For the Beck maps, at least 2 dozen survive. very few are exactly the same, which is really curious. So I'm actually starting to dig in and looking in detail at each one. And you have some informative variations, ownership, the mill icons, place names, and it's clear that there's increasing geographic knowledge of the island as people go on, because you see here, this clearly still was not fully surveyed in the northwest corner. That becomes far and far more detailed as the maps progress. What am I going? Here we go. So Beck actually printed two versions of the map. This one has 8 windmills, 74 animal mills. And then the second map, which is far more common, there's 21 windmills, 94 animal mills, and I've dated around 1755. Now, one thing I find very curious is the animal mills are depicted differently within the same map, the same printing plate. So I think that this means that different individuals are actually doing the engraving on the printing plate, because you have this one here with the 2 little dots that contrast with this one here and then this one here, and they're like next to each other. I'm like, why would you have depicted these differently? I'm scratching my head on this. Why would you have done this? But you can see different places. There are slight differentiations, variations on a theme. Obviously, they're all the same general idea, but the details just a little bit different. Now, on the first printing, they did windmills. I said there was 8. I think there's 8 on this image, and they all look pretty much the same. The sails facing mostly towards the east, and the wind is coming from the east. You have the tail pole on all of them, and then the nice cone, and then kind of a semicircle at the top. They're all looking pretty much the same. In the second printing, they tend to look a little bit different. And that's because what they were doing, if you see here, animal mill, animal mill, animal mill, animal mill, animal mill, animal mill. Oh, they just actually just engraved over the animal mill, okay? With this one exception here, which I find fascinating. In this one, you had an animal mill on the first printing. They buffed that out and put the windmill on the other side of the stream. That's fascinating. So they were clearly, he's trying to locate these geographically more or less where they are. So, you know, this mill here in the south end, this one in the northwest corner, this mill kind of on the western edge. And so you'll see that there's differences in the ones that they added. A lot of times the sails are facing you rather than facing east. They just face the viewer. And that's so that you could just convert the engraving in the animal mill to a windmill by adding the sails. And then you have a couple here that were added that look an awful lot more like the ones from the original printing that were added because there was nothing in that block before. There's nothing on that estate. Now, I showed you the animal mill converted to a windmill. There's a couple cases too where the animal mill from the first printing, and then in the second printing, you see that it disappeared. And I'm just wondering with these, was what I don't know enough about how the maps were printed, but you see that it tends to go from kind of darkest to lightest, and you barely make out these, but here you can clearly see the shadow. So I don't know, maybe this was the first one printed and it got the ink and then you printed another one, or maybe it just kept wearing off, or they saw it and they like buffed it out. I don't know, something happened. So this just between the printings. And then I included some of the annotated maps here to just say, yep, there it's still, you still see the ghost of these mills that were done out, that were buffed out. Now, this map was a 1766 map, the annotations, and this map was based on the first printing of the map, of the Beck map. All the other annotated maps were based on the second printing, and the second printing had a lot more versions of it that have survived. So I just want to give you an idea of with these annotated maps, not only did they add information like adding windmills, animal mills, they added the plantation owner names, and then they did watercolors to block up the different individual estates into larger groups. Like this is 4 different estates. You can see this is 6 estates all together. So they can say, all right, this is owned by an individual. And you can see here, there's a table down here at the bottom, and the table is identical in terms of the number and the distribution. And they're all 63 windmills. But when you go and count them, this one only has 60 windmills in the body of the map. This one also has 60, and this one only has 56. And so I'm wondering, can cartographers count? I mean, what the heck is going on here, guys? Why did this happen? And this happened repeatedly. And then these are later. These are about 1770. This one, they didn't add any windmills. They just added the landowner names and then the plantations, and then they outlined in red the people that were actually Danish that were in Denmark. I thought that was kind of interesting. And again, here you got 67 windmills. Oh, this is only 21 because that was the original map. So, and then you had some manuscript copies where they actually, somebody at the same time period, forget the printed map, we're gonna hand draw one of these things, and only they're unique. Well, this one was printed, this was put in a book called Oldendorp by a guy named Oldendorp that he was a Moravian minister, and he came down to do things. He wrote a book, and it was great. You know, you talk about people doing editorial privilege in that, and the editor censored a bunch of the stuff that he wrote because it was not what people in Europe really wanted to read at the time, because it talked about some of the harsh conditions, and so they edited that. But just about the maps, here's the table again, here's the table again, 63 mills, and there's a little, looks like a crosshairs from a gun, you know, circle with it, crosshairs. And then this I think these look like an envelope because it's a rectangle with a little X, and that's an animal mill. This is a windmill. So they depicted things, and each one of these have different information. And I'm in the process of picking through and looking at the names. And I'm planning to compare the names to the landowner list so I can get better dates on these, because they dated them, and I'm suspicious of the dates, because a lot of times they would date the table, and I'm like, well, the table and the map don't match, so what date are we talking about? So I've mentioned some of these, and I just want to point out some examples. Here's a good example of where they're hand drawing a windmill over an animal mill, and then they colored the mills of a red color so they would stand out. And then they added some mills de novo. This is one that they just hand drew in here, down here, 24, which is right just south of Christiansted. And then up here at Herman Hill, they added just hand drew some stuff in. And each one of these maps is very, very unique and provides new information. And certainly I'd love to know why there was this flurry of maps from 1766 to 1770. What was going on that made it so exciting to put these maps together? So when I mentioned that at least Beck, when he first did the map, really cared about where things were. So if you look at his map over here, and I took the 1920s topo map and circled where they were, fairly accurate in terms of the location. And remember, the survey had just been completed, and they're still learning how these things work. By the time you get to the 20th century, knowledge of topography and how you do that had increased tremendously. So it's reasonably good. So now that's not to say that they didn't make some big boo-boos and big mistakes. And I puzzled over this for a while about how accurate these locations are. And I concluded that in this case, the mill that they depict here at West End on the west side of the road is actually incorrect on these first couple of maps, and then copied here. And here they get it right. Oxholm in 1794 gets it right. This is an Oxholm map from 1778 that just was Frederiksted. And he puts the mill and all the settlement on the east side of the road. And here the ruins, you can see this is a current topographic map on the east side of the road. And I'm really sure that it's the original mill that we find on the east side of the road, because when you look at this inscription over the main entrance, it says 1749. So I'm pretty sure that they didn't like they built a mill in 1810 and then inscribed 1749. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And when you look at the mill itself, it's got a lot of the features of the earlier mills. So I think what happened is this first maps, this was a very rare case where it was not accurate. And this is from the Cronenberg map. You can see how detailed the information was. This is the guy that shacked up with Alexander Hamilton's mother, and but he did meticulous, just absolutely fantastic work. And he was on St. Croix several years trying to get the survey done and then drawing this map. So, and I mentioned the Oxholm, the 1778 maps. You can see these are the full maps. Frederiksted is on the west end here, and then Christiansted is Center Island, and he did something with the towns, but then he detailed the estates around them, so you get some interim information, and I think it's very good. Peter Oxholm not only was there as a surveyor, but he became a governor of the Virgin Islands, and really was very knowledgeable about everything going on. It's not like he was some guy that didn't know much. He really knew the islands very well. And I'll say the same for Cronenberg. He was there for several years. So this is the big map that Oxholm published in 1799. And here's another example, Can Cartographers Count? He puts this table over here, and that's where we got the legend down here, which I showed you before, the windmill, the horse mill. And the table says 115 windmills, 149 animal mills. Well, I go out here and I count the icons that are on there, and I say 117 windmills and 61 animal mills. And so I'm still scratching my head. Well, what was he talking about? So we have another opportunity to learn something. And I mentioned this, the survey that was published in 1856 by Parsons. Well, and there were some other iterations of the map. It was 1856. They made some updates, and I've recently just, because so much has become online, I'm looking at these maps going, wait, there really are these very slight differences, and that's going to be a next project. But in the 1858 map, there was 110 windmills and then 20 towers that were decommissioned for 130 locations. And then the update, 112 windmills, 17 towers, 129 locations. Again, I can't figure out, where did these things evaporate? I don't think so. Why did they scratch them out? So now, enough with maps. Let's go explore a little bit about what I have found in the field, and we'll look a little bit at animal mills, and then we'll look very closely at the windmills. So the animal mills, you can see that these are 3 different examples of animal mills where I'm able to get a decent picture that means something. And, you know, the vegetation you see in the back here is very typical, as well as here, very typical. So if you don't mow the grass and keep things trimmed, in 10 years, this would be completely covered in bush. You can see how you would lose this in the bush. It's like, okay, it's a wall, and it's hard to make out. Now, this in the lower left is at the WIM Museum, the St. Croix Landmark Society. They have not restored it. There are 3 vertical rollers that actually have fallen over on the far side. And after Hurricane, I want to say Maria, that was what, 5-6 years ago, they have not restored that back. They've been having some operational problems. But this gives people an example of what it is. And actually, I'm taking this picture. I'm very close to where the windmill is, and then the steam chimney is just off to the side over here. But these are 3 examples of animal mills. There are others, but you know, I figure I'll give you a good examples. Now, I told you about the trough that went out, and this is a view of similar to what we looked at. This is Cane Bay, right here overlooking the sea. It's a really beautiful location. This was the animal round. This is where the rollers would have been, and this is the trough, and then this is a close-up of what the trough actually looks like. And I commend the property owner that's gone in there in the last decade or so and cleaned this up so people can see it. It's a really nice thing. So let's talk about windmills. one of the things that fascinates me, and one thing I liked about the windmills is you can find them in the field because they're pretty tall. Okay. And I'm going to go over each of these different elements. This illustration was actually drawn by Peter Oxholm and published, and it's a really good depiction of what the windmills look like. And I've got all these arrows just to tell you there was 3 different work floors because you needed a floor to get up to the area where the sails were and the gearing. You got the center shaft, and you're gonna have a work floor here so you can do maintenance or transit between the main work floor here and the top. You got the main entrance here. We're looking from the west into the windmill up here, and the same thing here. This is looking from the west, and obviously you're gonna have an entrance ramp that comes in, or it could be stairs. And then for the openings, we're going to talk about each of the openings. This would have been the machine slot with some stairs going up to the work floor. And then in dotted lines are features that came in a little bit later. Windows, there's a hearth, and then there's the flue. And one thing I find very interesting, you have the hearth here and the flue. So the flue always went over the machine slot and not over the juice trough. And I think that's so that they wouldn't get the chance of anything dropping down into the sugar juice. I don't know, but that's just my supposition, because you'll see that the machine slot is a really tall, narrow slot, and to put the flue over that weakens the masonry and puts a greater strain and stress on the masonry tower. So there has to have been a good reason to do it that way. We're also going to look at the vertical timber slots, and these would have been in this part of the mill where they would have held up. And I've got an example where the original wooden rail is there, and you can see how these work. And you can tell if the top part of the mill is collapsed if these don't exist. And I just highlighted the masonry tower. Oxholm says they're about 20 feet, and I've actually I've visited. I can identify 119 locations where windmills were built on St. Croix. I took a tape measure and I measured them all, and they're all consistently right around 20 feet. And then, of course, here you have the juice trough opening because the sugar cane gets crushed, the juice goes out. And then you have the bagasse opening. Bagasse is what you get left after you crush the sugar cane, and you got to get that out of the mill, so they toss it out this opening. And I've got a very curious example of that. So the vertical rollers, I showed that. And just to give you an example, here's my daughter. She's very beautiful and personal dad pride. And then you have Brian O'Reilly. He's about 6'3". He's a big guy. He's built like a door. And this is the sugar cane behind him. So you have an idea, and they're standing right there. You can see they're standing right by the sugar cane. The sugar cane is 10, 12 feet tall. It's tall stuff, but you only really want the thick stalk of it. And you're gonna, in this case, you're gonna put the cane through this roller here. You're gonna put it through the thick opening first, and then it's gonna go around and come through the thinner opening, because you get some of the juice out, then you get more of the juice out. I'm sure many people have done like squeezed oranges and lemons, and you don't get all the juice out at one time. And so you crush it here first, and there'd be somebody in the back side of the mill feeding it back around to the other side. And then the bagasse opening will be here, and you're tossing the bagasse out in that opening. So I'm just going to walk through the different features of the mill and systematically look at the openings. And the masonry towers vary in size and shape. Okay, and I've got a person in most of these. So this is my daughter. She's about 5 foot. What is she? 5'7", Hannah? 5'8". So what, about 170 centimeters, something like that. And then this young lady is about the same height. And you can see all of us. Brian's a lot taller than everybody else because he's 6'3", so he's about 2 meters tall. And so you can see this mill is a lot taller than this mill. This is one of the tallest mills on the island here. So they're different sizes, and some of that is the location where they are to catch the breezes best, and some of it too is the time period where they were built. And this is the current mill at Wim. There are sails, but they got blown down in the hurricane and haven't been replaced. And then in terms of shape, you can see all of these are conical, pretty strong conical shape. This one is a lot less conical. It's more cylindrical. And then here, this mill, I love, this is called Hard Labor. This is the one that I was driving by. I was driving down here after the hurricane, I look up in the hill and I say, wait, that's a windmill that's not on any map. And it sits on the top here of this ridge, and then the cane juice went through on the west side under the sails about 200 feet straight down into the valley where it was processed. But this is sort of like, this is almost like just like a cylinder, not like a cone. It's very much up and down. And I don't have any current pictures of that because the bush has grown up so much. I didn't even try to walk there yet. Maybe in the future. I want to take a drone and do that. It's going to be a lot easier to get to some of these locations. And here in the back, you can see the airport and then the Caribbean Sea beyond. So one feature of these, people wonder, well, how do they survive? Well, and I anticipate that, you know, a lot of these structures are, you know, well over 200 years old now. And I speculate a lot of them are still going to be here in another 200 years because the walls are thick. You can just get a perspective on the ladder and the openings here. At the bottom, 5 feet thick. The walls are 5 feet thick. And then at the top, they're about 3 feet thick. And I have here these are some mills that collapsed. All the mills that have collapsed on the west side. And that's happened for, I think, 3 reasons. One is you have several openings. You have the main opening, the big ass opening, which is going to weaken the masonry. And then the afternoon sun beating on it. And then also the wind and the rain coming from the east. The wind blows the moisture through the walls and weakens the walls. And I've got other examples that I will show you that this reinforces why I believe this. And you have some different construction materials. I already highlighted the fair plane where you have the cut stone block. Here's another example. We have the cut stone block and then the rubble in between. Here's my little buddy, Brian, just giving you a good scale and scope of, yeah, this is a big thing. And this one has cut stone block on the outside. Everything is nice, neat, and regular. This would have been a field stone mill like this. This mill actually is at Great Pond, where the mill was depicted on the 1856 map, literally of sitting on the seacoast, where the earlier map showed it inland a little bit. And now this one is literally on the beach. I'm standing right, the waves are lapping at my feet here. And I think that what happened is you had some shoreline erosion at that location. But also here, what you see how these long, skinny stones, this would have been the interior wall. This is the exterior wall. And then they have the rubble fill, but it's more consistent in between than, say, this wall here, where you have these rounded stones as rubble with some, you know, sandy mortar in between to hold the wall together. Just a very different construction. And then I included this one at Orange Grove. This is Orange Grove in the West End. And you can see how they wanted to have some decoration. They had these brick stripes. This all would have been plastered. And I included this because all the mills would have had plaster all over them. This is the east side. And you see this darkened material, just like the limestone or a lot of the statues, say, in Rome that have gotten dark because of all the pollution. Well, this is reflecting that here. And then all the plaster is worn off here, I think, because the moisture is coming through and pushing the plaster off on the west face, combined with the afternoon sun hitting the face of the mill. And then I show, this is a mill here at Campo Rico, where you see the very, very deliberate rows of stones, and they have the same finish on the inside of the mill as the outside of the mill. And a lot of times they were less so with the cut stone block, but with the field stone and some of these, the inside, the facing material was the same as the outside. So talk a little bit about the main entrances. Pretty consistent, always on the west side of the mill, because the sails are rotating on the east side of the mill. And so the main entrance here, you're bringing in the sugarcane into the main entrance so they can get crushed. And it's the largest, you know, like square footage opening in the mill. And here's earthen ramp that went up to this. This has stairs. Now this mill in the middle has been redone a little bit. The stairs may or may not be original, but some of them did have stairs. This is WIM, and this had a ramp. And so there's multiple ways to get in. And we're going to look at some inscription stones. This has an interesting keystone. There's no inscription on it, but it kind of stands out. And then here's the WIM one, and it has this accentuated trim around the outside. The plantation owners really did care about what things look like. They would not have invested as much in the appearance of these buildings if they hadn't really cared what things look like. And here at the WIM, this is actually what this is the mechanism the sails were on, and after the hurricane, they haven't put those back on. I mentioned the inscription stones. These clearly signify that these were built at a certain time. So this is, I'm going to presume ED means erected, 1803, 1808, and this says erected. So I'm pretty sure that means that this is the date it was built. And then this one says built AD 1856, rebuilt 1840. So they were actually rebuilding some of these mills. So, okay, I have this mill, it's working. Okay, now I have to overhaul it. And we'll see an example or two of that as moving forward. There's some less obvious dates where I started to look into these and say, what do these things mean? All right. So 1808, that very well could be a construction date. This is 1820. This is 1796. Now this map is at Wills Bay, which is on the North Shore, really rugged area. And what I really confused me initially about this is this does not appear on the Oxholm map, which was published in 1799. That was before I understood that the map, the data was only collected through 1794. So like, okay, I get why this wasn't on there. So this is one where I had a mystery, and I think I solved it by, okay, the mill didn't exist. They had an animal mill in that location, and this was just the fact that the mill was actually built after he stopped collecting information. Here again, we've got this is the Concordia Mill 1749 that I showed you before. So these I'm thinking are construction dates. Now, these all have initials or dates on them. There's Juliana, and I can't read what it says below that. I don't know. This one says Cecilia and 1803. And I know that this is not a construction date because this mill appears on Oxholm's map, and where it's located, they wouldn't have torn it down and started over again. This is what was originally built. And so I'm really puzzled what happened with Cecilia in 1803. I need to know. This is inquiring minds need to know. So this will be when I get more into the archival stuff, try to solve these problems. Now, RIP 1769, one might say, rest in peace. Somebody died in 1769. No, actually, I want to say John and Peter Robinson owned this estate, and 1769 would actually be consistent on when this windmill was built. So I think going back and looking at the maps and the land ownership saying can help some of these mysteries. And then this is ND, and this was Nikolai Dunbaven, 1763. This would have fit on when it was constructed. But this one, LMS, NO, and then it says C, 1778. And the problem is this could not have been a construction date because this appears on maps prior to 1778. So you have all these different inscriptions. What do they all mean? Great. What are the people that built this? What do they intend with this? All right, the juice trough opening, obviously a pretty important opening because you want to make sure that the sugar juice gets out. This is why you built the windmill, so we can get the sugar juice out so we can cook it down and make products. And just typically they're going to be a little bit on the shorter side. And you can see here where the interior, where they're lined very nicely. This is not the original floor. And there would have been beam holes here, but they've been blocked up because this is the mill I showed you with the stairs that had been redone at called Rust Stop Twist. Here is a juice trough opening. This has been converted to a kind of dwelling. It's like a patio type of place. And you have this wall here, and then the boiling house is over in this direction. Always the boiling house is going to be in the direction off of where the juice trough opening. So once you know where the openings are, you're like, okay, the boiling house is going to be over that way. And this third one here is very interesting because there is another juice trough opening, but at some point, this was the juice trough opening. This is the one where I showed you the animal mill where you could see the juice trough in the ground. And this is my buddy Orville James. And so you can see this is, a little over 1 meter tall. and you would have had a box in here that to receive the juice. You can meter it out if you wanted to. And then it went through this opening and this, and then the wall going along this way went right by the animal mill. And one thing that was going on at this period of time, you're always going to have an animal mill going with the windmill at the same time, because if the wind stops blowing, remember, you got 3 days to get this stuff crushed. So if the wind stops blowing, you got to keep going. You can't just say, well, we'll just wait till the wind starts blowing again. You don't have that luxury. So now the bagasse opening is intriguing for a number of reasons, and I'm going to show you some outliers here because these raise a good point. You have to have, every mill has a bagasse opening because you got to get rid of the crushed sugar cane. So you have, this is the main entrance here. You're bringing in the cane and you're throwing out the bagasse. Now you got two openings here. What's going on here? Well, what happened? You'll notice you got cut stone here, cut stone here. You have bricks here. What happened was you saw the rebuilt inscription stone. They were rebuilding these and actually reversing the rotational direction of the sails. And I'm not sure why, but they would build another bagasse opening. And this happened enough times. There's enough examples where, and this is just the clearest example where it's so easy to see, you've got these two different materials. Okay, one of these things was built later than the others. And when you look at them very closely, you can very easily see the difference. Now, all the bagasse openings tended to have a sloped floor because you want to get this stuff out. This is an extreme example. This is Castle Coakley. On my first slide, the inner slide, there was two windmills next to each other, and this is one of the windmills. And I think that this set of windmills was doing contract crushing towards the end of the sugar growing period because they built this massive complex, and this is part of it. The bagasse opening, you see, this is going to go down, and this is from inside the mill. This is from outside the mill on the other side, and this pit is about 10, 20 feet across, no, 15 to 20 feet across at least. It's a big distance because they would bring donkey carts to pick up the bagasse, and then they would use the bagasse and they would light the fire. They would use it to run the fires under the cauldrons that were boiling down the sugar juice. So this is a pretty extreme where you have all this masonry structure that was built around here. But this is a great illustration of having this sloping floor going outwards. The machine slot, one of the less used but essential. Every windmill has a machine slot, but they weren't used during the crushing typically because this was when they were going to change out the innards of the inner workings of the mill. You got the long beams and stuff. They would take them through this entrance, and you can see here the stairs going on the masonry stairs, and typically they're going to be covered with blocks of wood. And you can see here there's blocks of wood at the top, and here there's another example where they would have blocks of wood at the top. So if you're bringing something in, you're not banging it against the masonry. The wood is a little bit more forgiving. Here's a great example of the red plaster that's around this opening. This would have been original, and you can see the plaster has survived on this mill pretty well. And the decoration, they're trying to emphasize this. So they really cared what these mills look like. And this is from the inside, the top. And then I want to just highlight here, that's a beehive, and it's very common to see beehives. And then you have these are some of the wood beams that have survived. These are original. I would love to go and take some samples and figure out what species of woods they are. That'd be kind of cool information to know. What's survived this long? What the bugs haven't eaten. So I mentioned the hearth. In St. Croix, I like to joke that, if the weather gets below 75 degrees, the Red Cross is out there handing out blankets because it's like a weather emergency, And so you certainly don't want to keep, it's not that you're trying to keep people warm, right? With the hearth. No, I think what this is they're trying to light up the inside of the mill so you can keep running it at night with more safety. And one thing I didn't mention is, and I have several different sources that I'm going to trust say they kept an axe in the windmill or a sharp machete, because if somebody got their arm stuck between the rollers, there's no brake on the sails, you cut the arm off. Otherwise you suck the person in. So they want to have better light. And so this is kind of the typical hearth where the flue is going to go off to one side. Here, the roots are growing down through it. I love that. It's like, okay, yeah, it's going all the way up there. And then here's from the outside, here's the flue. And in this mill, the hearth is in this wall and the flue's going up over the machine slot and then out this way. And obviously you want it on the leeward side of the mill because you don't want to have anything that could flammable that's going to get caught up in the sails or maybe light up the caps. You want that part I get, but I'm still confused why you would take it over this, what I'm going to think is the weaker part of the masonry, because we're going to have the vertical slots in here. Just an interesting thing of, and I've not seen a lot of documentation about the hearths in the mills. And in fact, a lot of the stuff that I'm looking at, I've seen very little about the specific workings of the windmills. So I want to add this to the people's understanding of how things work. Windows. These were typically slightly later. You don't find these in the earlier mills. This mill on the east end, this is on the west face, this is the main entrance. And this is the exterior, this is the interior, these brick line. And I have to believe that these were for illuminating the work floors, because this is one set of beams here. There would have been a floor here. You'd had another floor here. So you got a window here. So things are lit up. You can see a little bit easier. You don't have to like take a torch up there with you. That's a little bit dangerous having an open flame in here. And then these two are very typical, either an arched opening or a square opening. Oftentimes the exterior was square. Oftentimes the interior is arched, and the interior is always larger than the exterior because that helps suck the breezes in. And these are both on the east side of the east face of the mill, so that, you know, the wind is coming this way. You're getting a breeze, you're getting some light. I would imagine that the inside of the mill, when you're crushing cane all day, every day for a couple months, is going to start to get pretty warm just because of the friction. And that's why I don't think the hearths were for warming people up, it's for light. Floors, you know, we walk on them all the time, don't always pay attention to them. Most of the floors in the mill look like this rubble part here. And what happened here is a lot of them were removed. And you can see here, this looked like kind of a brick sized surface. And if you look over here, this is part of that Copley Bay I showed you with all the masonry and whatnot. This floor is worn really smooth. So if I'm not using the windmill anymore, I got this nice smooth floor, I'm going to use that to line my new building. And so almost all the windmills have had the floors taken out. Now this is the interior of this mill. What happened was it had a windmill, and I think I've got another picture here from the outside. And Brian is standing roughly a little bit to the other side of far side of where the 3 crushing rollers would have been. But in this case, the shaft came down. There had some sort of gearing here. Then there was this shaft here outside, went out here, and then there was a horizontal rollers on the outside of the mill, which just extraordinary stuff. And I know I've got some slides in here to talk about this, but I want to highlight that on this slide. Now I showed you in what previous slide some of the wood that still remains, and this is a mill where some of the original rest of the stuff, the guts in the mill were. So this is the internal shaft, the main shaft that comes from at the top of the mill down to the top of the rollers. So this would have turned round and round and round to drive the rollers from using the force from the sails. And this is it looking at it from the side. And then here looking up, this is the carriage on which the shaft would have lain, and the windmill, the sails would have been out to this side. And then this would have held, this would have been there would have been a bearing in here so the shaft could turn, and then the shaft would have been anchored down here. This is looking up at this part from the main entrance. And then you've got these vertical slots here, and you can see they all end at this. This is a wooden rail up here, and the cap of the mill would have sat on that and been able to turn around. Okay, so that actually still exists out there. And this mill in particular is interesting because, you know, the 1856 Parsons map, that was an Admiralty chart. This mill is a great landmark if you're entering into Salt River Bay. And I used to work out of Salt River Bay, going in and out of there every day. And I'd line up that mill and say, all right, I'm going to hit the cut in the reef. and for some reason it doesn't show up on his map. And I'm like, how could you left that mill off? I'm using it all the time. It's great to get into the bay. So we can talk a little bit more about the beam slots here. This is just an example. These are the vertical slots. And I mentioned that if these collapse, you can tell that if you don't have these, the mill have collapsed. And this is one where half of them here, this is from the exterior, half of them have collapsed, part of them are still there. So you can see, and that's because this is just weaker masonry because you have these slots in there, so it's much more liable to collapse. And then you have these beam slots here. These would have supported the floor. This here would have been the beam. There's a beam that goes north to south in the mills that holds the 3 rollers in place. This is looking at the main entrance. And then this would have been, this is the juice trough opening. So this beam would have gone into this kind of hole on the side. And you have these at every mill, you see these. Now, one intriguing thing, I use these beam slots to understand a rebuild of a mill. This is a state river that looks like a really tall windmill. And the reason is, at one point in history, they actually lowered the floor about 4 feet, over a meter. And I know that because you have these beam slots that should never, this is the window, this is a hearth. The beam slot should never have been this low, but if you lowered the floor, that would make sense. And here's my buddy Orville, and he's showing this is the intersection. The original floor would have been here, and then they dug all this stuff out, and then they put new beams in the wall to put the mill back into operation. So imagine doing this kind of masonry and having a windmill, and they'll say, you know what, I don't want a solid foundation. I want air under there. I want to store some stuff under there. Forget this river thing where we're just going to have go down to the, make the shaft longer. I don't know why they did that, but they redid the mill. So we're going to just put a basement under with as part of the construction of the masonry tower. So the mill working floor in this case is here. And this underneath is a basement. And this is the center post for the basement. You have, and this would be a storage area. This is a different mill with a storage area. And this picture is, I took this picture this is looking to the east. I turned around and this picture looking towards the west. And then this little spot here is because the masonry ramp up into the mill has started to collapse. And I'm really lucky I haven't fallen through anything and hurt myself badly because there's a lot of subterranean stuff. And then here you've got another basement that's just basically an archway underneath the whole mill. So they made the mills higher and they created a storage area. Other structures I just want to highlight. This is I talked about the mill at Castle Coakley where they had the horizontal rollers on the outside. Here's where the horizontal rollers are. You can kind of see the iron post, the bars where it would have been anchored. This white gate here actually covers a cistern that's probably a couple thousand gallons. And the sister mill that's right, if I turned around, I'd be right at the sister mill, has a similar cistern under it. This would have been the trough that would have gone from this area, and then it actually dumps out right here. So I'm like, okay, you can take this trough and then dump the juice right down in here. And that's why I think it was probably contract. They probably were contracting for other mills in the area. Like, all right, don't run your mill. We'll run the mill. It's sort of like, grain mills. You have the miller, and the miller and the farmer were separate people. And then this, I mentioned the hard labor. This is a different one called that, where the hard labor is the one that was like a cylinder and they went downhill. This is another one called Mount Victory. These little turrets would not have been original, but over right in about here, here's the mill, and over right in about here is this hole in the ground, and it's a covered pathway that is only, it's less than a meter tall, and the juice trough would have gone here, and the factory is about 150 feet lower down in the valley. So they have all there's lots of complicated stuff. And this is actually another cistern at Hams Bay where this is right outside the juice trough opening. And so they were dumping the juice in here and then metering it out into the factory, which was down in the distance past this picture. More with Castle Coakley. Here's the two mills. This is the entrance to the bagasse opening. So you would have the donkey carts would have come in here and gone to collect the bagasse. And here is, this is from the North Mill I showed you before. Here's the posts, and then the cistern would be right behind this photograph. Here's the South Mill, and this is from the juice trough. And this was the opening that went down, and then you go from this picture here right to here, and there's a pipe in the wall, and on the other side of this wall is a cistern that's several thousand gallons. It's a pretty big structure. So they were doing some really interesting things as time went on. I already talked about how they did changed everything at Castle Coakley, the way that they had the mill set up from vertical to horizontal, and this here is where the horizontal mill would have been situated. Oh, and we have got alternate uses. Okay, so St. Anne's Church owns this mill, and they made a little cathedral out of it. This is somebody's living here. This is a schoolhouse. And then this shows you how they block mills up for storing water. And I selected this image in purpose because this is an opening here. And then you have another opening here, and the arch ends here. And I'm still puzzled. Why would you have done that? It's just such an interesting thing. I don't know. Steam mills. I just want to give a shout out to the steam mills. There's not too many of the machinery left. These are the horizontal mills. This is the Wind Museum on the right. This is up in Annalee on the left. And they would have fed the cane in here. And they started this windmills in 1816. They kept building some steam mills in 1816. They kept building some windmills, I think, after that, because the steam mills didn't work very well at first. They were really quirky. And if something broke down, you're an entire season waiting for the parts to get from, you send a letter off in a sailing ship to Scotland, make us a new part, send us a new part. It's going to get there some months later. Now there are brick chimneys, and I'm going to show you that, 50 to 100 feet tall. And typically you're going to run these until late in the 19th century. You're going to run this equipment alongside other equipment. So you know, when one goes down, you've got a backup. You got some redundancy. Some boilers still out. Now I'm told that during World War II, a lot of the scrappers came by and took up as much iron as they could. So it's rare to find this equipment out in the bush, but every time I see it, I try to document it, take some pictures. And here's a few steam chimneys, just a variety of different chimneys. This is about a distance of about maybe 10 feet. So some of them were really close to the windmills. Here's just looking up one of the chimneys. And then these two, I posted for a very good reason. This was taken in the morning. The west side of the mill collapsed and took the east side down with it. And this is in the morning too. And this is actually the east side. This is the west side. So again, the west side collapsed, took the east side with it. So it's not just the windmills. It's not the openings that are making the collapse on the west side. There's other forces that are happening that are preferentially collapsing things to the west. And I did want to just mention water or wind was used also to either pump water out of the ground or pump water from a cistern somewhere else. And these come in all different shapes and sizes. So I wanted to at least give an overview that, yeah, these exist. And here you can see one of the steam chimneys in the background. Orville, the black guy in my picture, Orville, he lives near this and walked by this for several years before the bush was cleared, and he realized that this structure was back there. And like this, he is standing about where the road is. So it's like maybe 30 feet from the road and he can't see it. And this is the interior of the mill, of some of the water towers, just to give you an idea. They had beams in them. I'm not sure exactly how all of them work. There was one well tower that I found that had water in it. Everything else was bone dry in the bottom. So the water table's definitely changed. So how can I learn more? Well, I'm in the process of building a 160-page website. Should launch at the end of April. You see the web address, stcroixwindmills.org, And I'm dedicating one page to each estate that had a windmill, so I can talk about specifically how did that show up on historic maps and what photos do I have it for right now. I've located each one on maps. I've got GIS coordinates, and that's all. You can click on things, and I'm really interested in getting feedback on this. And I have pictures from when I did this research back in the 90s, but I'm going to take a little while before I complete before I add those, because I've already got over 500 images that I'm putting on this, plus then this is just photographs, and then this is a big enough bite. We'll do the next photos in the next iteration. And so I'm going to add the photos. I want to go back and do some drone footage, probably in the summer when the winds don't blow as much. I want to add the information about the animal mills, and then I want to open up some community history, and I'm probably going to do a quarterly newsletter to tell people what's coming next. And then some other stuff. I'm going to publish a paper this year about the Beck map variants, because there's a lot to that, and trying to date those and get more, how accurate are they, and can we put more accurate dates on them? And then I want to look at the Oxholm and Parsons maps to say, all right, how much variation is it between those? And then I want to estimate the dates for windmill construction based on a number of different variables, and then look at when they were decommissioned. And now I've talked way too much. I'm ready for some questions.